So howdy, folks. Welcome to the September edition of Cattle Trails Showcase. I'm Ron Wilson, Poet Laureate. Glad to be your host. The purpose of the Cattle Trails Showcase is to continually highlight the communities, historical elements, museums, and other attractions along the historic cattle trails. The showcase is brought to you by the International Chisholm Trail Association, of which Dennis Katzenmeyer is president, Michael Grauer is vice president, Nancy Lawrence is secretary, and Mary Lou Rivers is treasurer. And our showcase chair is Lonnie Steben. On these programs, we've learned a lot about the attractions along the Chisholm Trail, the Western Trail, even the Shawnee Trail. But what would we find along the Goodnight-Loving Trail? That trail was pioneered by Charles Goodnight, who was truly a trailblazer. His adventures also helped inspire the best-selling Western novel Lonesome Dove and all that followed from that. Charles Goodnight also built a huge stone barn in Pueblo, Colorado for a ranch there. That barn was built more than a century and a half ago and was fairly recently saved and restored. And today we'll hear about that barn from a volunteer in Colorado who was a leader in that effort. Laurel Campbell from Pueblo, Colorado is going to tell us about the Goodnight Barn. And Laurel, the floor is yours.
All right, let me try this. We'll share the screen and get it off of. Hold on.
And presenter mode, and we're there.
Yeah. Okay. I've done this recently just a time or two, but I used to do this like 10 times a year. So forgive me if it's a little slow. This is our logo. It was done by a local artist, and we love it. He gave that to us as a gift. The Goodnight Barn Historic Preservation Committee was formed in about 2013. The barn is owned by the city, and this is the barn in 1974. We have pictures of it. We have one picture of it, the really oldest picture, and it's blurry, and nobody can seem to find any other pictures of it. As Ron was saying, the Lonesome Dove and movie and book was actually Oliver Loving, and Goodnight. Goodnight was Call, and Loving was Gus. We contacted Larry McMurtry to come and speak at one of our events, and he said, I don't travel anymore, but he sent us a check to start our fundraising, which we thought was wonderful. And of course, he's gone now, which is sad. Charles Goodnight was born in, and this is really a lot about his history, but we do talk about the trail, and we'll get more involved with the trail as we get more involved with you guys. So he was born in 1836 in Southern Illinois, and his father died, and his widowed mother married a neighbor farmer, and they decided I should probably go back on. They decided they were going to move to Texas in 1836 and 1846. And that is where Goodnight got most of his education, because he had maybe 2 years, but he was a very smart man. This Caddo Indian, his name was Caddo Jack, he taught him everything to do with being scouting and trailing. And so he was a very good tracker and trailer. He also was freighting in Texas prior to his becoming what I would say a ranchman. And so he did this as a young child. This is his mom, and his mom was widowed again. So Goodnight actually really took good care of her. And he built her this house, which is really rustic, and I'm not sure what year it was, but it had to be when he was about 20 years old, so about 1856. He rode with the Texas Rangers. This is not a picture of him or his troop, but it was one I could lift off the internet. He actually was their lead scout, and he was in the frontier battalion during the Civil War. That was his service in the Civil War. And he rode to the Peta Comanche camp, and found a lady there who he determined was white. And they also determined that her name was Cynthia Ann Parker, and she had been stolen when she was 12 years old. And this was, I think she must have been 30 by then. And so they retrieved her and brought her back, which is not something she wanted. So she didn't live very long. She wanted to go back to the Comanches. This is her son. You may have heard of Quanah Parker. He was the Comanche chief for the last years of his tribe. And Goodnight was his enemy until they were good friends. When he started on the reservation and they were all starving, Goodnight gave them bison and longhorns to feed them because the government wasn't taking care of them. This is just a picture of herding wild longhorns, because what happened was after the Civil War, they had a statewide roundup because there were so many loose longhorns all over the state, and they're an ornery bunch, if you probably know that. So it was a challenge, but Goodnight and his brother-in-law, Wesley Sheik, decided they were going to start a little ranch. So they gathered up about 2,000 head. And after they had done all that, the Comanche stole every last one of them. So they had to try again. And when they were able to gather enough, big enough herd, his brother-in-law decided to get married and back out. So Goodnight met Oliver Loving, who had been a rancher and a storekeeper and had actually done some trails in the 1860. He was very early on, and he was 20 years Goodnight's senior, and he was a mentor, and they partnered. This is a picture of it's, I don't have another picture of Loving, but that's an older picture of Goodnight. This was their trail. So getting back to the trail, it was backwards J, and the reason for that was because the area in the Panhandle around Amarillo and those areas was Comanche territory, and they were not good neighbors at that point. So Goodnight and Loving sat down and figured out their map to go from Fort Belknap down to Fort Concho and around. And actually, they were making their way to Fort Sumner. And the only, let me see if I've got that picture. The only, and One-Armed Bill Wilson was one of their best cowboys. Just looking at the trail again, Loving's last roundup in 1867. We'll talk a little bit about on the trail there, but you can see at the bottom where it says Goodnight-Loving Trail, you can see Horsehead Crossing. They had no idea. They hadn't done this before. This was their first trip. And so they had to go across 80 to 90 miles of no water at the Llano Estacado. And they knew that they had to do this, and even though they had to change it, you know, the actual way they went, they had to push that cattle for 7 or 8 days, and they didn't let them lay down because the cattle wanted water and they weren't getting any. And so they lost quite a few on that first trip. And when the cattle smelled the river, the Pecos, about 7 or 8 miles out, they started running. And the unfortunate thing about it was that when they got to Horsehead, most of them got pushed off the little cliff there into the river and either drowned or broke their legs because there were others jumping on top of them. So they lost maybe 300 cattle at that. And of course, Horsehead Crossing, if you've never heard of it, it was kind of not named by the Indians, but they used to hang skulls of horses and cattle there because of the way it had quicksand and it had other problems. And so it was a very famous crossing. They were making their way to Fort Sumner. And this is a picture of the era of Fort Sumner. And Fort Sumner had a reservation for Navajos and Apache. And so Goodnight and Loving figured they could sell their beef, which was 8 cents a pound in Texas, to $8 a pound at Fort Sumner. And there's a picture of some of the reservation Indians.
And there's a picture of some of the reservation Indians. And there's a picture of some of the reservation Indians. And there's a picture of some of the reservation Indians. And there's a picture of some of the reservation Indians. And there's a picture of some of the reservation Indians. And there's a picture of some of the reservation Indians. And there's a picture of some of the reservation Indians. And there's a picture of some of the reservation Indians. And there's a picture of some of the reservation Indians. And there's a picture of some of the reservation Indians. And there's a picture of some of the reservation Indians. And there's a picture of some of the reservation Indians. And there's a picture of some of the reservation Indians. And there's a picture of some of the reservation Indians. And there's a picture of some of the reservation Indians. And there's a picture of some of the reservation Indians. And there's a picture of some of the reservation Indians. And there's a picture of some of the reservation Indians. And there's a picture of some of the reservation Indians
In 1867, on their third trip, I believe it was, they were running late, and Loving had to get up to the fort to bid on a contract for their beef, and so he left early. And if you've seen the movie, you know what happens. It was a little bit, they took license. They had it in Montana, but it actually happened in New Mexico. He and his one of his trail hands, that one I showed you, the one-armed Wilson, were attacked by a large group of Comanche and were able to hide in a little cave under the side of a river, along the river. And Loving got shot through his arm and into his side, and he wasn't doing well, losing a lot of blood. So Wilson, who they were there for days trying to fight off the Comanche. So Wilson, there was a storm, and you probably all know about how arroyos fill up with water during a good storm. And so it filled up, and he went into the water and floated down past the Indians and started walking toward where he felt Goodnight would be. Well, eventually they did find him. He wasn't in very good shape after that, but Goodnight traveled to the fort because he found out that Loving had been picked up by a Mexican group and taken to Fort Sumner. And he had suffered gangrene in his arm, and he would not let them take the arm off until Goodnight arrived, and that was too late. So they removed his arm to no avail, and he died shortly thereafter. Goodnight making him the promise that he would take his body back to Weatherford, Texas. He didn't want to be buried in what he called was a foreign country at that time. So they buried him temporarily at Fort Sumner. They made they took cans and made an inner lining for a coffin with the cans, and charcoal and a lot of stuff to keep the body from getting too bad. And they buried him there. And eventually Goodnight came back down and fulfilled his promise and took him to Weatherford. As most of you probably know, Goodnight invented the chuck wagon, and I always have to give credit where credit is due. He had the idea, but his mother designed the chuck box, which makes sense. She would know what everything you would need. And the actual, there we go. Whoops, let me go back. I'm sorry. This would be the chuck box on the end of a Studebaker wagon that he bolstered with steel and steel wheels, and he knew that it was going to be a rough ride, and so he really upped the strength of the wagon. This is an actual chuck wagon. It's not the one we're going to get. We're going to get one, which is wonderful. But it shows you where the water barrel was, the coffee grinder, which was absolutely necessary, the hooks and little boxes where they kept everything. And the cookie was the one that had control of the liquor, because Goodnight didn't allow liquor or swearing, which was funny because he was a constant swearer, and no, well, obviously no betting. It just destroyed, they stayed up too late and everything. So he banned all that. So this is how they traveled, and the cook would go on ahead for maybe 15 miles. And on his way, he would gather things to cook. And of course, Prairie doesn't offer a whole lot, but prairie chickens and gophers and snakes, everything, And the famous, I don't know if you can see it right under the hanging lantern, the Arbuckle's coffee. That was what all the wagoneers used. And they actually still make it in Tucson. So this is how they traveled. They actually had usually another wagon. Now, I don't know if they did, but because I've never seen a picture of that or seen that spoken about. But they used to hang a canvas under the wagon and the bedrolls, and the wood would go under there. Like I said, the cook would travel ahead, and this became part of everybody's, all the trails, they use this. And so the cook would be there ahead of them, and prepare supper. But what was really interesting to me was that he would, before the morning came, during the night, he would face his wagon toward the North Star, so they knew what direction they were going. This is the Llano Estacado, or Staked Plains, that I was talking about, that they went across. Nothing there to be a landmark. And when the Spanish came through in the early 1500s, they put stakes in the ground to lead their way back. So it was called the Staked Plains. This is just a picture of the drovers on the job. Of course, this isn't Goodnight, but it is Longhorns. And they had, I think, 18 crew. And of course, the newest or youngest got the drag at the back and ate dust all day long. This is Horsehead Crossing. I think I'm a little ahead of myself, but you're still getting a picture of it. And this is a stampede, which would happen in thunder, or a bullet being shot, a gun being shot, or Indians, anything. And a stampede was the last thing that they wanted. It was, they had to turn them in on themselves to get them back into a group. And sometimes it was days before they could get traveling again. This is a lightning caused stampede. And I thought I had a picture of how the lightning goes from tip to tip on their horns. Sure. And this is night riding. They all had to take their turn. I thought it was just a beautiful sketch. It shows them, they used to sing to the dogies, and it calmed them. And this one is a moonlight sonata. They're mooing and and the taking of shifts. That was the night riding. And riding drag. There they are, eating all that dust. I just think it's a lovely picture. So Goodnight was lucky. He found one of his steers that was a definite leader. His name was Old Blue. And this is not a picture of Old Blue, but it's kind of what he looked like, because he was what they call steel, gunmetal steel. And he just took the lead. He was above all the rest, and he knew it. So he would get up, they'd all get up. He'd lay down, they'd all lay down. And he did most of his traveling when they went to Dodge City, but he did go to Pueblo several times. And he also wore a copper bell around his neck. And I don't know if you know Vero Goodnight, but she's a great niece. Goodnight's never had children, so she's a niece from one of his brothers. And she lives in Mancos, Colorado, and she is a wonderful sculptor and painter. And she did this of Old Blue with his bell. And there we go. And the other one is Old Maud, or supposedly, and Old Maud was his favorite. And she had 23 calves. And I just feel for her. I think that was tough. And what really was special about Old Blue was that he didn't eat feed. I mean, he obviously grazed along the way, but when Cook called for chow, he was right there. And the cowboys really encouraged him to do that. So he would eat their meal, and it would really upset the cook. So just a cute story. Okay, so as he's going up, this is getting into Colorado. Goodnight saw west of Pueblo, about 4 miles, a beautiful area with it was surrounded by bluffs, so it was kind of protected from snow and everything. And he loved the area, and he decided he was going to buy part of the Nolan grant, which was a Mexican land grant, from this lady who bought it all for $10,000. And originally it was about 50,000 acres, or maybe it was more than that. Anyway, it got down to a smaller acreage when the government stepped in. And she sold a third of it to Goodnight and a third of it to a gentleman named Peter Dotson, who had the 3R Ranch a little later than Goodnight. But they were able to run their cattle over this whole area. And if you knew the area, it's huge. It was from where his barn was to the mountains, which was 25 miles, south down to Greenhorn, which was about 40 miles, and then west toward the St. Charles and up the Arkansas. And of course, the Arkansas was the main reason he chose that area because of the water. And this is one of the oldest pictures looking east from the barn, cottonwoods. And I learned that cottonwoods only live 100 years. So obviously this is not what it looked like exactly at that point. And this was a western view from the ranch. And it kind of includes part of his quarry where he got the rock to build his thing. This I discovered from Bill Green, Panhandle Plains Museum in Texas, who was a Goodnight aficionado, and a gentleman by Joseph McCoy was traveling the area visiting all the big ranches. And this is about 1869, because this is previous to the barn. And you can kind of see where the house was that he built. And he also had an orchard. This is the earliest photo we have of the barn. We think it's about 1890, 1895. It had a rock corral, and you can see up in the right-hand corner, the windmill. We're working on getting a windmill from some people in Lamar who collect old ones, and I think they may want to donate it to us. It was a horse and carriage barn, as you can see, and there's low buildings in the back, probably bunkhouses. And if we ever do an interpretive center, I want it to look like a bunkhouse. This was used as a dairy, and I think this is about 1940s. You can see the silos in front, and you can also see they must have taken down most of the rock wall, which was kind of a shame. But you can see the river in the back, and that was a dairy for probably from about 1912 to 1970. And Pueblo had 280 dairies at one time. Here's Charlie. About the time he was in Pueblo, good-looking guy. And this is Molly, or Mary Ann Dyer, who eventually married him. They were supposed sweethearts for a while. She lived in Weatherford, Texas, and for several years, he kind of courted her. When he got to Pueblo to build his ranch, she wrote him a letter and said she was tired of waiting, that he had to make a decision, or she was going to, he should set her free. I don't know if they were formally engaged, but everybody in the area knew they were together. So they spent, they got married in Kentucky with her at her uncle's place, and they came by train as far as they could toward Pueblo, and then stagecoach, which was not very comfortable at that point. But they stayed at the Drovers Hotel on Santa Fe. And she woke up the first morning, and the Coe brothers, who were a gang of cutthroats and murderers, two of them were hanging from a telegraph pole. And I kind of thought this was made up, but I've read it in every single book about Goodnight. And that is, she said to Charlie, these people are uncouth. I want you to take me back to Texas. And he said, but Mary, it didn't hurt the telegraph poles. And that's what they said. And up above where you see the rectangular, you wouldn't know this, but that's original El Pueblo fort built in the 1840s. And of course, there's nothing left of it now, but they have the museum there and a little mercado area to sort of recognize it. It was only open until 1850 war, when some Comanches came in and killed most of them. We're talking a lot of the mountain men were there. This is the Stock Growers Bank, and this is a bank that Goodnight started with a couple of other people in town. He got really into Pueblo. He bought all sorts of things. He was planning on staying here. He had farmland, and he had, this is the first survey that we have of it. You can see the little box there. It shows the barn on the right, and then the orchard, and we believe the house was right below the orchard there. There's nothing left of the orchard. I know he paid $1 a piece for apple trees to come in a stage, and I think he got like 80 of them. So that was pretty expensive at that point. When he was during his years there in 1873, there was I guess a recession, and it was a bad one. And he lost money all over the place. And so he decided he was going to take what's left of his herd and head down to an area that a Mexican friend of his really romanced and said, this is just beautiful. It's perfect for you, the Paladuro. And when he got down there, he had to agree, and he set up there. Sure if I've got, yeah, the dugout that he built, and actually brought Mary to. She was a hardy woman. She put up with a lot of stuff. Her nearest neighbor, female neighbor, was 60 miles away. So she was on her own, but she became the cowboys' mother. She took care of them. She nursed them. She helped feed them. John Adair came into the picture. He was an Irishman that he was in Denver doing, I think probably something like, well, he had a business where you invested, and Goodnight met him and they started talking, and he said, I want to go down to Texas and start a ranch. And John Adair said that's exactly what he was aiming for. So they became a partnership. This was the Adair house near Paladuro. Also, Goodnight, and I'm sorry, winging it back and forth, but Goodnight also was part of vigilante justice. He saw his share of hangings, mostly for horse thievery. When I give that to the kids at fourth grade, I don't show that one. So this is the Goodnight home that he built in 1888, and they have restored down in Goodnight, Texas. I have not been there after 11 years. You'd think I would have been down there because they do have a museum, but I haven't been. And at that point, the buffalo were being disseminated, and there were hardly any left. From the millions and millions that roamed, there was just a scattering and a smattering of them. And Molly was very intrigued with them. So she started having her ranch hands pick up a lot of the babies that were left without mothers when the buffalo hunters came in and shot. They didn't want the babies. So she started gathering them, and she started building up a herd. And the southern bison herd was saved by Goodnight and Molly. It's now at the Caprock State Park, but it has the original DNA from the southern herd. It has really not much to do with the northern herd, which would be Yellowstone and all that. This is a separate group, but they did save them. And as a matter of fact, he gave a small herd of them to the Pueblo Indians at Taos, and they are still alive and well. He also decided he was going to try to crossbreed cattle with buffalo or bison, and he called it a cattle. They didn't work out very well. I think this guy looks like, man, he's beautiful. But what happened was most of the calves were being carried by the well, actually, it was by that time it wasn't Longhorns. What was it? It was just something he shipped to Herefords. That's what it was. And the mothers had trouble birthing these. They were so big. So he gave that up and decided he was going to go into the filming business. This man did everything. In 1916, he had a silent film called Old Texas, and that's him during the filming. And behind him are Kiowa, who were friends of his that were part of the movie. And at the end of the movie, and they even had a buffalo hunt. They staged a buffalo hunt for the younger Indians who had never had a chance to do that. This is a picture of Molly and Cherry and Charlie, probably at the end of the filming. Molly died in 1926 and left Goodnight alone, and he wasn't very healthy. He had been corresponding with a gal named Corinne Goodnight because she was interested in the fact that they had the same name. Well, after Molly died, she decided that she was going to go down there and take care of him. And I can't help but believe there were some ulterior motives, because she had a brother that was a banker that pushed her to do this. And once she went down there and started nursing him, and he got better, actually, and well, until he died. But Corinne actually, they got married on his 91st birthday. He was 91 and she was 26. Supposedly she was pregnant, I mean, a lot of people say that and that she lost it, but I have no idea if that's true or not. This was his brand in Pueblo, P-A-T. We think it means Pueblo, Arkansas territory because of the Arkansas River, but nobody has really figured out. We had this remade, and it wasn't his same brand in Texas, so it's a little bit of a mystery. But he did have another brand with a PAT-M that was from Mary, who started having some herds. Of course, when I'm giving this to people, some of them have never seen branding, and this was a picture of cattle branding. This is just silly. I thought that was kind of clever and make everybody smile a little bit. Going back a little bit, when he was trailing, he went across Raton Pass, which is between New Mexico and Colorado, from Raton, New Mexico into Trinidad, Colorado. And Uncle Dick Wooten, if you've ever heard of him, owned this area, and he had Indians that dug it out and made it into a passable road. And when Goodnight got there, he wanted 10 cents a head for his herd, and Goodnight, being very, very, I wouldn't say cheap, but that was money on the hoof, and that was taking away from his profit. And he paid it one time, maybe two. I've read two, but usually it's just one time, and told him he'd never come across again. And Uncle Dick said, "Oh yeah, you will. There's no other way to cross." Well, that's not true. Goodnight went 30 miles east to Trinchera Pass, and it was an easier pass, and he didn't have to pay anybody. And when he got to Apishapaw Canyon, the river is the Apishapaw, he set down his swing station, and he used this area to rest the cattle, fatten them up a little bit, and it was near what they call hogback. They always use some landmark to move along. I was telling the guys yesterday when we were practicing this that we were able to go down to that area, and there were 3 cowboy graves, and they were all attributed to Goodnight. The one on the right was a Texas cavalryman, and somebody put a new stone up. I've never been able to figure out. It says Thorpe. You can't see that. The middle one was J.T. Callahan and Thorpe died in 71. J.T. Callahan in 1869, supposedly by the snake bite. And the one on the left is a mother and baby, and nobody's been able to figure that one out for sure. This is the remains of a bunkhouse. He used stone for everything where they stayed. And what's really cool is this picture here of a fence. Like I said, he always used rock. And when we went down there about 8 years ago, you could still see the leather strap where they closed the gate. And we just want to believe it was the original one. Probably not. Okay, here we have the trail again. The first one was, the Goodnight-Loving Trail was the left one where it says Loving, going through Raton and up through Goodnight and the Goodnight Ranch. And they went as far as Cheyenne, and they met a guy named Iliff, who was a rancher. If you've ever seen Centennial, I encourage you to do that. It was the Veniford Ranch in that movie. Fabulous history of Colorado. And they took the cattle trail part from Goodnight. But you can see the Apishapaw down here and Trinchera Pass, so you can see it really wasn't a big change. And then he did have other trails, but the main one was this one. He also did the Granada Trail in 1875. This is east of Colorado Springs. It's called Corral Bluffs, and it's where when they were on the trail, they would rest the horses or the cattle again. It was a natural bluff corral. We've been there. And you probably know this, but the Indians, before they had guns and horses, would stampede a herd of bison to a cliff. and it was called a buffalo jump. They were all over the West. And once again, just like the cattle at Horsehead Crossing, they would become injured or die. And that was usually their bison for the year. There is a ranch west of town, 25, 30 miles, that is owned by some very good friends of ours. It was called the Babcock Hole Ranch in Wetmore. And it was Goodnight's winter quarters for, it was again in a little valley, and it was a good place to winter. He kept some of probably his Herefords there when he brought those in. And the people have been so good to us. They have a lot of things on their ranch, and they want to donate to us an old log cabin, which was not what was there at the ranch, but it was period type. This is the restored Goodnight Barn. I was surprised the State Historic Fund allowed us to put a wood shake roof. I would have thought with the chances of fire, it would have been a little bit questionable. And on top there's a large pigeon cote. And that pigeon cote, when they took it off to repair the roof, they left it overnight and came back and someone stole it. So we had a picture of it, so they were able to redo it. And we all know, or should know, about the Western Territory prior to 1854. So we were actually part of Texas at that point. And in 1848, the war with Mexico was over, and they ceded this to us. And this would be a typical picture of a cowboy and a trail hand who was riding his motel room. And the reason why I say that is he had everything on there that he needed. He had hardtack and water and his gun and his lariat or his rada, and everything that he needed was on there for him to live and move. And that's exactly what they did. And then what we were learning and grateful, it was the Mexican vaqueros that came up, because that breed of longhorn was a Spanish Mexican breed brought over by the Spanish to Veracruz, I think in like 1700, and then they moved north. Anyway, these guys taught them, and let me see if I can find the writing on that so I can read it. Yeah, right here. Okay. So they taught our cowboys everything there was to learn about the longhorns and how to take care of them. They taught them about branding. They taught them about stock laws, roping, equipment, land grants, and we still use many of the Mexican words like lariat, corral, remuda, charro, and chaps, which is exactly what they taught them, all that, and brought them all that wonderful equipment. We have a lot. We used to do dinners at our Pueblo depot, 1889 depot, because we couldn't get in the barn at that point, and we had a vaquero dinner, and we actually had some charros out of Canyon City with their Andalusian horses dance for us. It was fabulous. Oops, come on, you can do it. There we go. Always fancy, always with their big sombreros, always made a splash. Bo's eye card. He was a black man, and he was a good friend of Goodnight's, and he was his right hand. And Bo's was so trusted that he carried whatever money they had to the bank, and because nobody would figure that a Negro would have that. But he rode with Goodnight on all of his trails. And at one point he wanted to stay there with him in Pueblo, and Goodnight encouraged him to go back to Texas because they were friendlier with Negroes then. And I'm like, okay, well, whatever. So these are some paintings of him. The one on the right shows Hole in the Rock, which was another landmark for them just over Trinchera Pass. And just knowing that about 25% of the cowboys were black. They came, from slavery and came out west and learned. This is a famous picture of Goodnight with his bison. He's superimposed over it. And this is him at about 80 years old. He took his final ride on his horse. I think I can't read it, but I think it was Butter. Let me see. I'm so glad you guys are with me, hanging in there.
Buttons.
Button. I can't read it because of our pictures there. In the mid-1920s, he dismounted and he handed the reins to his foreman's wife, Retta Hubbard, and gave her his horse and saddle. But I need to change that because I've learned so far that it wasn't his wife. It was the foreman's mother. She moved in with the Goodnights in 1905, cooked and cleaned for them, and brought her baby. She was widowed, brought her baby, and they raised him. And so they never had children, but they did have some young men that they actually raised. So there he is on his horse, Buttons. A little porkier than he used to be. Okay, this is the barn as we first got into it. It was whitewashed by the dairy, but you can see the 1870-71 wood, which is original. It's about 95% original. The door down there is original. It had, let me see if I can figure it. These were put in when it was, oops, sorry. Previous. Oh, well, this is it now. There it is. You can see that these were very fancy, and 3 out of 5 of them were original. So we saved them, and then they made new ones. But nothing he did was ordinary. And so, he put keystones in the rock work and made it kind of fancy. We had heard about a group of Scottish carpenters that were in the area, and we believe they may have had something to do with this. But what a beautiful sight when we went in there. You can see when it was a dairy where they washed down the urine and everything. So this is what it looks like now. Well, kind of. It's got a lot of stuff in it right now. But it's going to be a wonderful event place. The reason why we haven't done that yet is we don't have bathrooms. So we're working on that, writing a grant. We have had a couple of truck wagon rendezvous out there where they bring in porta potties. It's not an ideal for a Western wedding. I've had so many requests for that, but without the bathrooms, it just couldn't be done. So this was it in 1974. You can see what they saw about the original pigeon cote. And the State Historic Fund argued with me about the doors because they said they weren't, I said they needed to be Pennsylvania Dutch doors, which would open on top. And they said they don't have a picture of that. They can't do it. And I said, wait a minute. This is how you can't have a horse and carriage barn and then not have some air flowing through it. And so they said, send me some pictures of 1870s barns with that. And I sent them a whole slew and they approved it. So this is the barn today. I showed that already. This on the right here, I want to point with my finger. This was gone. This was here. And so they were able to get some similar rock from Trinidad. One of their older buildings was not in good shape. And so we were able to get that from them and put that back up, and it balances better. That's why we did it. And this is the barn at night, which I think is a beautiful scene. This was the plan. It's not going exactly as planned. The barn here, the house here, and maybe redo the orchard and put back the corral. And this would have been an interpretive center and possibly a pavilion for show. I do this PowerPoint for a lot of different people, so that would be a great place to do it. It's right next to the state park, which has the largest lake in Colorado, and it has 3 to 4 million visitors a year, and we figure this would be a good thing for them to do on an evening. So we would encourage them. And that's that. Have you got any questions? Yeah, any questions?
Thank you, Laurel. Fantastic information. We do have a couple of questions in the chat, how
Oh,
many would a cookie cook for? How many could a cookie serve? And were there more chuck wagons needed in that case?
well, this being the first time they were ever used, uh, they had 18 guys and the three, the cook and Loving and Goodnight. So it was a herd of about 2,500 it started out with, but I've read in a lot of places that maybe 18 were about the average, and most of them were very young. Uh, and they learned a lot on the trail, and he was able to kind of mentor them along. But um, it, I would say maybe up to 20, and it depended on the size of the herd.
Yeah. And then you had pictures showing both a trail hand and a cowboy.
Mhm.
Question is there a difference between the two?
Probably. And the reason I say that is because the actual drovers had everything they needed through the food truck, and their bedrolls, So they probably didn't, it wouldn't have been a standard look, but it's a great picture and it tells a great story about them moving their house along with them. So
And I can share that the original young men, almost all men, who moved those cattle north on the trail drives were really referred to as drovers. And Laurel
yeah,
used the term drover a minute ago. So those were drovers. And cowboy, as in two words, cowboy, was really a term that came later. And the origins of that go back to the European continent. And so cowboy became a term that was slightly more contemporary, and now it's a generic term. But so the trail hand would have been the cowboy working on the trail,
yeah.
is my understanding. The
Mhm.
question about the pigeon coat, or sometimes called the dove coat, was a. Would you explain what that is?
Well, it simply was a way for air to get in, but also, and I don't know why they put that on there, what the reasoning was, but perhaps they ate them scrod. I don't
My
know.
understanding, my understanding is that the pigeon cote or the dove cote was simply a place that the birds could take shelter
Yeah,
in that high place, and that
yeah,
also provided some ventilation
yeah.
for the building.
One of
Uh,
the, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Laura.
Well, I was just going to say one of the gentlemen that's married to a former member of our board, who is probably about 90 now, I'm not sure, but he lived about 2 miles from the barn. He grew up, and he and his friends would go down and climb up on the roof and steal a few pigeons and bring them home. They wanted to train them, and the next morning they were gone. They had come back. So,
Oh, funny, funny. I know we're approaching our time boundary. Tom Hawk, you have a question?
Yeah, I have in 2022, I completed my uh, driving of the Chisholm Trail.
ah,
In 2023, I did most of the Western Cattle Trail, and I have the desire to trace the original Goodnight-Loving Trail. Um, I am curious as to whether or not there's a map available that would allow me to take a look at the Gazette and atlases for the state of Texas to find the roads, whether or not they're paved or otherwise, that would allow me to stay as close to the original trail as possible.
well, uh, that's a good question, and I can tell you that there have been some people that have written about it. And I was trying to find the one where I showed, where the heck is that? Um, the more detailed one, that would be your best bet. And let me see, I'm sorry, can't remember exactly where it was.
That's a good slide right there. That
Yeah,
really shows
yeah.
the beginning of the route.
So it
Hmm.
was so once he crossed Horsehead, he stayed on the west side of the Pecos River until he got to Fort
Some,
Sumner.
yeah, yeah. Or Bosque Redondo is just south of Fort Sumner, and he was uh yeah. Then he went on the east side. Um, Crossing was fun, I'm sure. What in the
Is
heck?
there a bridge, a highway, or a road that crosses the Pecos River?
Don't know. I haven't been down there, and I would have to. There it is. I would have to. My friend Bill Green's gone. He probably would have known that. You know, when I was talking to people early on, I didn't have all my ducks in a row, and so there were questions that went unanswered when they came up. When they came up, some of the people weren't available anymore. But you can probably take. There is. Let's see. I think it's Highway 10 that goes through the Apicha to the Apishapa. It's not a well-traveled. In fact, some of it's dirt, but you can see where he went over Trinchera Pass. And if I can do a little more research with my note, I have notes and let you know what towns they're near now. I think maybe Folsom might be close to the Trinchera. But he kind of, if you can see my pointer, he kind of went this way. And obviously at some point he went west and was able to see this site at Pueblo. And I'm trying to paraphrase what he said. He said, it said Goodnight saw the lay of the land and he saw it as a perfect spot for his ranch. And that would have been his ranch, his home ranch. But the 1873 crash changed all that. But we do honor him here. This was his first place. We don't have a picture of the house because it burned in 1884, but supposedly it was a Queen Anne, probably with the gingerbread and all that on it. Anyway, this is the closest map I've got for it, Tom. I'm sure I'm sure if you get a hold of the Goodnight House Museum in Texas, or the Panhandle Plains Museum, they have a large collection of his things, and they
And
may.
Last
I
year,
might,
last year I went to the Goodnight House in Goodnight, Texas, and I encourage you to go there. The little museum is very well set up, and the people there are very nice. I went to Paladuro and Caprock as well, and saw the bison. Um, uh, and yeah, I hope to be able within the next year or two to be able to claim that I've driven
Yeah.
all three
and
of the.
I might add that we'll have folks from Goodnight Loving Inc. and from Horsehead Crossing at the Western Trail Conference in Dodge City. And given our time, I probably need to thank Laurel for an outstanding presentation, and that
You.
also leads us to our next Cattle Trails showcase. Lonnie asked about is the barn open to the public? And as I understand it, Laurel will do tours kind of on demand.
Right.
So,
Right. And
and
my number is on the website and I can give it to you now. If you ever come this way, I really want to show it to you because it's nobody has ever called a barn gorgeous, but people who walk in there say, this is gorgeous.
and Laurel will be at the Western Trail Conference coming up in Dodge City as well. So Lonnie, tell us what's on tap for next Cattle Trail Showcase.
Well, we're going to dedicate the next Cattle Trail Showcase to the conference and some of the sites and things to see while in Dodge City along with the conference. And there's tours kind of planned throughout the 2 days. So, and if anybody's kind of interested in staying longer than the conference, the Convention and Tourism Bureau CVB would be available to help line some of that out. But it ought to be a great conference, great speakers, and we'll find out more about it in October.
And what
I,
is the date on that? October meeting?
It'll be the second Friday as usual. I think it's 11th.
October 11.
Oh, great.
October 11. And
Same
then
time.
and I just put in the chat the link to register for the conference on November 1st and 2nd. And Laurel will be at that conference in November, as will many of us and folks from the Goodnight-Loving Trail, as well as the Shawnee Trail. So it should be an exciting event. We hope you can join us in Dodge City November 1st and 2nd, and join us for Cattle Trails Showcase on October 11. With that, until next time, this is Ron Wilson, Poet Laureate, saying thanks for taking time to join us in this place, and come on back next month for our Cattle Trails Showcase. Many thanks, Laurel, and happy trails, everyone.
Thank you, Laurel.
Thank you.